So I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker. Ron Gibbs is a man of many talents and accomplishments, a modern day Da Vinci. To me, first and foremost, he is a friend. Beyond that, he is a Philadelphia native, husband of the lovely Jane, grandfather 3 times over, clinical professor of obstetrics and gynecology and Knowles Distinguished Scholar at Stanford University, president of the California Map Society, collector of maps, lecturer on American Revolutionary History, author of The Long Shot, an alternate revolutionary history of the Battle of New York, in which George Washington is shot by a British sniper. And perhaps most importantly, he personifies the word gentleman. He also has been a partner in the creation of 2 exhibits featured prominently on the digital gallery. And one of those exhibits is the basis of his talk today. He's also my captain for the day. I'm going to be his assistant here. So I give you Ron Gibbs.
Thank you, Tom. In 2018, I made a presentation on the campaign of 1776 at this meeting. And so this is the sequel, the campaign of 1777. And as Tom said, it comes from an exhibit that we just put up on the digital gallery. So the first slide, Tom. So as they say in the television series, previously in the American Revolutionary series, the cause of American independence was on the brink of disaster in December 1776, when General George Washington decided on a bold stroke of war to save the revolution and indeed to save the future of the United States. So jump back with me now as we go back 250 years nearly to the campaign of 1777, the momentous campaign of 1777, and see why it is a decisive year. Next slide, please. So this is George Washington, of course, from June 1775 through the 8 long years of the American Revolution. He was the sole commander-in-chief of the American Army. George Washington made mistakes, all right, but he usually learned from them. He had incomparable integrity. He had resilience, and he eventually led to victory. Next slide. Recall that in December 1776, George Washington had his back to the wall. After his dwindling army retreated across New Jersey, they found temporary safety on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, where Tom is pointing this out. With the traditional fighting season over in December, the British went into encampment, mainly in New York City, and with a string of posts down across New Jersey to the end of the line at Trenton, shown by those first crossed swords. This detailed battle map was published by William Faden in 1777, and it shows the heroic actions of George Washington's troops between December 26th, 1776, and January 3rd, 1777. Washington decided that the one course of action could save the course of the revolution, and that was to go on the offensive. He chose an isolated Hessian outpost at the end of the line in Trenton. On Christmas night, 1776, as shown by the blue arrow, Washington's army crossed the Delaware River and then proceeded in 2 columns towards Trenton. The result was a complete surprise and a complete victory for the Americans. Washington, that was at Trenton by the left cross swords. There's another pair of cross swords to the northwest, and 10 days later, George Washington achieved a second victory at Princeton, and these twin victories breathed new life into the cause of the American independence and established George Washington as a battlefield commander. After the Battle of Princeton, the Americans went into winter encampment in Morristown, which would have been north and west of Princeton, and the British basically retreated to New York. Next map. This map of the British Middle Colonies in America was originally published by Carrington and Bowles in 1771, and it shows the seat of the war in 1777. The maneuvers and the battles spanned over 700 miles from British Canada to the upper wilderness of New York, to Philadelphia, down to the Virginia Capes. These were mind-boggling distances in the late 18th century, given the slow rate of transportation on land and by sea. And for the British, these problems were compounded by divided command and poor coordination from London. Next slide, please. In April 1776, General William Howe officially became the British commander-in-chief in North America. Although his forces led to victory over Washington repeatedly during the campaign of 1776, Howe was often slow to follow up, and Washington's army was able to extricate itself repeatedly. But in the aftermath of the battles of Trenton and Princeton, General Howe believed he could end the rebellion in the spring of 1777 by capturing the American capital of Philadelphia. From his headquarters in New York City, General Howe wrote to the Secretary of the American Colonies, Lord George Germain, in London, to approve his plan to take Philadelphia. But since it took 4 to 6 weeks for a letter to simply cross the North Atlantic, time and distance worked against a unified British plan. Next slide. Well, here is British General John Burgoyne. He was nicknamed Gentleman Johnny, and he earned this name because he was a bold and aggressive commander. He was also a reckless gambler. He was a playwright and an amateur actor. In 1776, 1777, he commanded the British forces in Canada. In December 1776, he did a winter crossing of the Atlantic, went to London, and then lobbied the Secretary for the American Colonies, Germain, to get approval for his own plan for the campaign of 1777, and that was for an invasion of Upper New York from Canada. Next slide. Tom, if we could show those arrows. There we go. Thank you. This map was drawn by British Major Holland and was published in 1777. And it shows parts of the Middle Colonies and New England. In his comfortable office in London, Lord Germain gave his approval to General Burgoyne's complex plan for the invasion from Canada. It called for the main army, the arrow heading south, to come down the Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River axis towards Albany. A smaller army was going to be coming in from the west. This was under Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger along the Mohawk River. And the third force was to come up the Hudson, even under General Howe. And Burgoyne's idea was that these three armies would crush any American army in between. It looked easy on paper in Germain's office, but both Germain and Burgoyne far underestimated the obstacles the invasion was to face. And Germain, meanwhile, also gave tacit approval to General Howe to take Philadelphia, perhaps because of Howe's reassurance that he'd be done in Philadelphia in time enough to go back up the Hudson and help Burgoyne, or so he thought. So much for the strategy. We will now turn to the actual events and start with Howe's campaign in Philadelphia, and then return to Burgoyne's campaign. Next slide. So this map shows Philadelphia, the largest city in British North America. It was only 90 miles across the plains of New Jersey from British headquarters in New York City. General Howe believed that by capturing Philadelphia, he would take the heart out of the American Revolution, out of the rebellion. By late spring, he received approval from Lord Germain in London to take the American capital. Next slide. Erected in 1753, the Pennsylvania State House was the venue for the Second Continental Congress. Here on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was proclaimed, and this edifice henceforth has been known as Independence Hall. Next slide. And Tom, we want to show the arrows off to the right. Thank you. In spring 1777, General Howe set out from New York City to lure Washington's army from its stronghold in Morristown, New Jersey. But after 2 weeks, the large British force achieved nothing other than pointless skirmishes against the Americans. General Howe pulled his British Hessian force back to New York City for a new course. He boarded 18,000 men, complete with their complement of horses, artillery, wagons, ammunition, and tons of provisions upon 260 Royal Navy warships and transports, and set sail from Sandy Hook at the mouth of New York Bay. They set sail on July 23rd. The objective was Philadelphia. The mighty fleet, as shown by the red arrows, sailed down the east coast of New Jersey, across the mouth of Delaware Bay, around the Virginia Capes, and finally up the Chesapeake to Head of Elk in Maryland. When the British fleet disappeared out to sea, Washington agonized as to its objective. Were they going to Philadelphia? Were they going farther south to Charleston? Or would they turn around out at sea and go back up the Hudson to aid Burgoyne? Washington had pilots and coast watchers looking for the British fleet, and based upon inconsistent reports, he moved the American army back and forth, trying to head off the enemy. But it was not until the fleet was spotted high up on the Chesapeake Bay that Washington finally knew the British landing point. He then marched his army, as shown by the blue arrow, down to intercept the British. Yet the British voyage took over a month and resulted in the loss of much of the fighting season. While the British finally disembarked at the Head of Elk, they were not much closer to Philadelphia than they were 5 weeks before that when they were in New York. Accordingly, General Howe received much criticism for his decision to use the extensive sea route. Next slide. Next slide. By the way, we're going to be passing over a few slides that are in the exhibit just in the interest of time. This map from Marshall's Life of Washington from 1824 spans the distance. Tom, can you show the amboys in the upper right? The amboys in New Jersey to Philadelphia, a distance of about 70 miles. Philadelphia is now right there. And from Philadelphia down in the lower left to the Head of Elk, about another 50 miles. The British fleet began to disembark the army on August 25th after a nearly 5-week sea voyage. After resting his army for a few days, General Howe began the British march north and east towards Philadelphia. Next slide. And here we want to focus on the arrows on the left. By the movement shown on this copy, we see General Washington's defenses as the blue line at Chadds Ford along the Brandywine River. This is about 30 miles south of Philadelphia. The red lines show British General Howe's plan of attack. From loyalist scouts, he learned of unguarded fords across the upper Brandywine River, and he began a long flanking march, the upper arrow, at 3 o'clock in the morning of September 11th, 1777, while a large feint by the straight arrow was made against the center of the American line. The flanking maneuver caught the Americans once again by total surprise. Next slide. Next slide. This is a view of the Brandywine River at Chad's Ford. And we're looking from the American position on the east side towards the British Hessian position. The river is not very broad, it's not very deep, and the banks are not very steep. It was fordable in several places, and the Brandywine turned out to be a poor choice for Washington to defend the approach to Philadelphia. Next slide. Next slide. By mid-afternoon, General Howe's long flanking column crossed the upper branches of the Brandywine here at Jeffreys Ford en route to its attack on the unsuspecting American right wing. Next slide. And even today, as in 1777, the Brandywine River at Jeffreys Ford is narrow and shallow, making for an easy fording by the main British force. Next slide. This detailed battle map engraved by Faden depicts the battle at the Brandywine. At the lower left, we see Washington's position by the blue line and the feint of the Hessian British force by the three red arrows, attacking the Americans dug in along the east side of the Brandywine. Meanwhile, the main British force had completed its flanking march and was in position at the upper left near the Birmingham Meeting House. Hurriedly, American units under General John Sullivan moved into position, but despite their brave resistance, the British had the advantage. The American army was saved from devastating defeat only by an orderly withdrawal to the east as evening fell. Next slide. Next slide. This is a view of the Brandywine Meeting House. It was used as a hospital at the time. And this is on the north side of the American defensive line along the Brandywine. American forces rapidly formed a line to the left of the house to meet the oncoming British onslaught, but Howe's flanking force was overwhelming. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next. And next. This map is called The Surprise at Germantown. It was done by a British Lieutenant Hills and published again by William Faden. After weeks of maneuvering following the Battle of the Brandywine, the British marched into Philadelphia on September 26, 1777, without having to fire a shot. But Washington's fighting spirit was still up, and from his camp outside Philadelphia, he decided to attack the British at their main forward post in Germantown, a few miles to the north of Philadelphia. The attack began in the morning of October the 4th and initially proceeded well. But Washington's plan was once again very complicated. With heavy fog through the morning, the American attack unraveled. The British rallied under the direct leadership of General Howe and reeling. Next slide. This is a modern map shown by BritishBattles.com, and it shows the detail. Washington was in the center column shown by the blue rectangles coming down the Skipack Road. General Greene was coming down on your right, the American left under General Greene, and the militia was to come down on your left, their right, along the Wissahickon Creek. When the center column found a British regiment here barricaded in the Shoe House, the Americans stopped to dislodge the British from the Chew House. But this led to a delay and gave the British time to regroup. The British rallied under the direct leadership of General Howe, and that was the story. Next slide. This is a dramatic painting by the Brandywine River artist Howard Pyle and published printed in 1898. It shows the heroic efforts of the Americans to dislodge the British from Chew House. Next slide. Today, the Chew House looks very much the same as it did in 1777. Then it was owned by a prominent loyalist, Benjamin Chew. The Americans attacked the house to avoid leaving a fortified position in their rear. However, the British robust defense caused a delay in the American attack and its eventual loss of cohesion. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. Yep, I'm sorry, we'll just back up. Yeah. So this is called the March to Valley Forge, painted by William Trigo in 1883. And with the Crown forces completely in control of Philadelphia, Washington sought winter encampment where he could keep an eye on the British. This painting depicts the march into Valley Forge, which the Americans arrived at on December 19th. There, Washington and his men were about to face the heroic winter of 1777, 1778. Next. We now turn to the British invasion from Canada. This detail in the Holland map, if we can go to the arrows, Tom, shows the route of Burgoyne's main column of 8,000 men. At first, all seemed to be going well. They captured Fort Ticonderoga, and then they proceeded south. But in mid-August, General Burgoyne got a double dose of bad news. A raiding force of about 1,000 Hessians was captured in Bennington, Vermont, and the force moving in from the west under Colonel St. Ledger retreated back up the Mohawk. Though deprived of considerable strength, Burgoyne continued towards Albany, but a large American force was waiting to meet him. Next slide. This is American General Horatio Gates. He was English born, all right, and he had previously served in the British Army. And at the outbreak of the Revolution, he was one of the few American officers who actually had battlefield experience. He was older, about 50. He was snobbish, he was formal, and he was fussy. And behind his back, they referred to him as Granny Gates. But in 1776, he had proved himself as a valuable officer, and in 1777, he was appointed commander of the Northern Department of the American Army. Next slide, and next slide. This map was drawn by British Lieutenant Wilkerson, and note that it is oriented from the British view with the north at the bottom and the south at the top. To reach Albany, Burgoyne had to punch through the formidable American defenses. There was only one road south, and the Americans controlled that. On September the 19th, Burgoyne divided his weakened force into three columns shown by the three arrows, with each to probe the American lines. The hottest fighting took place at the left-hand set of crossed swords at a place called Freeman's Farm. At the sunset, the British held the field, but Burgoyne had lost 600 irreplaceable men. Expecting enforcements from New York, Burgoyne dug in. While the British hunkered down, their supplies dwindled, their position deteriorated as the American army now grew to over 13,000 men. Next slide. And next slide. This is a partner map of the previous one. It has the same orientation. Burgoyne's situation became critical when he got no word of reinforcements from New York City. Recall that General Howe was 250 miles to the south in Philadelphia. On October the 7th, Burgoyne ordered a reconnaissance in force on his right wing, these arrows. But the Americans were ready for him, and they forced the Americans back, forced the British back. They forced the British back to the large Balcarres redoubt, that first upper set of swords. And then they actually took the von Bremen redoubt there at the second set. Next slide. And next slide. And next slide. And next slide. And next slide. Burgoyne was trapped in the wilderness with no hope of relief from New York, supplies running out, and winter ahead. He sued for a treaty and surrendered on October the 17th, 1777. Trumbull's painting here depicts Burgoyne in red and Gates in blue as the central figures. The campaign of 1777 was a decisive year for the American Revolution because the victory at Saratoga ended the threat from Canada, raised morale in the army and the pro-independence citizenry, and secured the critical alliance with France. For General Washington, the campaign was marked by defeats at Brandywine and at Germantown, then the capture of Philadelphia, and then the long retreat to Valley Forge. Some in Congress and some in the army were now beginning to doubt the ability of George Washington as the commander-in-chief. But Congress and the army stood by him, and this was an essential part of the victory at Yorktown 4 long years later. So how, after all, did Washington win? He won because he was fighting the right war. He was fighting to keep his smaller, less experienced army intact, winning just enough times and gaining the critical aid of the French. By 1781, the British electorate, the British populace, had no longer any stomach for more blood and more treasure, and treaty negotiations were undertaken in Paris. So reflecting over the last nearly 250 years, we remember the campaign of 1777 and why it proved decisive in the American Revolution. And last slide.
So I think we have time for a couple questions.
Can you tell us a little bit about the spies that were helping Washington during that period?
Spies played a very big role in the American Revolution. There was all sorts of spy craft, and most of the spies spoke the same language, so it was easy. And the British often paid Americans. One of the most famous spies was named Benjamin Church. He was a physician and he was a spy, and there were many others. There was a spy ring that became called the TV show Turn, and that actually took later in 1779. So spying was a lot of the gamesmanship, and the information was important.
So I really enjoyed the juxtaposition of the historic maps and then the photographs from the contemporary setting. And I just wanted, this is actually a little bit more of a research question, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about I'm assuming that you took those pictures. Yes. If you could talk a little bit about the experience of sort of moving between looking at a historical map of a battle and then sort of following it yourself, and what that feels like and what that trip was like.
Well, thank you. It is a great thrill. And it's a great thrill for me, less of a thrill for my wife as we go trampling through woods and branches and rat holes and things. So I really did try to get the topography so that you could appreciate. The maps do a pretty good job, but they're often not quite so trained. So the one of the Brandywine, the one of Jeffreys Ford, the Battle of Brandywine actually is very well preserved, and many colleagues have done a good job with noting the places where things took place. So that's pretty good. I've been in New York City where you try to pursue the Battle of Manhattan, and everything is concrete. And one afternoon I was up in Harlem taking pictures, and I got some very strange looks when people were wondering why I was taking pictures of them. Well, I wasn't taking pictures of them. I was taking pictures of the top.
One of them is what thing is contemporary. What role did disinformation play in these battles? And I already forgot my second question, but that's a good one.
Well, I'll work on the first. So I don't know whether it was intentional disinformation, but it was incorrect information. So when the British, Tom, if you could just go back to that slide of the flanking maneuver. So, so when the British were, yeah, this yeah. So when the British were carrying out this flanking maneuver, Washington was getting all sorts of information. Oh, the British are coming on your flank. And then someone would say, no, they're not coming on your flank. And so the information was contradictory. And ultimately, he did not react to the fact that the British were making that information. And then the same thing when the British were on their long sea voyage coming into Head of Velk.
Question about what role, how were maps produced for the generals? Like, were people sitting in tents drawing? What was the process of map making like during the war?
So there were two kinds of maps, and one were these published for the public. And sometimes they were published within just 3 months of a battle, and sometimes they were published years after the battle. But the Americas were an unknown entity to people in England, and they were thirsting for knowledge about the war and the terrain. So these were engraved maps, copperplate engraving, and they were either published individually or in magazines and sometimes in atlases. For the generals, there'd be manuscript maps, and those would be used also. But they were very important.
Ron, thank you very much. This was wonderful.
Ron, we have one last question from Zoom for you, Ron. The viewer asks, how significant were the battles of Urskani and Fort Stanwix in foiling the British plans?
Very good. Well, if you look at the whole digital gallery, you'll see what happened at Urskani and Fort Stanwix. The inability of Colonel Barry St. Ledger to take Fort Stanwix caused his retreat back up the Mohawk, and that deprived Burgoyne of a large contingent of his army. So he thought he was going to have a 3-pronged attack. He had a 1-pronged attack, and it was weakened and very slow. Good. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Ron. It comes back.